Lyon, 1943. An SOE agent walks into a crowded bar, German officers at one table, a Gestapo informant at the counter, and his resistance contact pretending not to notice him. He's barely taken 3 steps when a chair scrapes behind him. A German officer stands, blocking his path. Papierin. The agent hands over his forged documents. The officer studies them slowly, too slowly. If the papers fail, there is no silent way to act. No pistol he can draw, no well rod he can hide in a search. Just seconds separating him from arrest, or worse. At last, the officer grunts and steps aside. The moment passes, but the problem remains. Situations like this happened constantly, and SOE agents had no silent, concealable last resort weapon. In this video, we'll explore one of the most discreet tools ever created to fill that gap. A weapon designed to hide on the body, be drawn in one motion, and fire almost silently at point-blank range. The sleeve gun. And to understand why it existed at all, we need to begin with the problem it was designed to solve. When moments like the one in Lyon passed without incident, agents didn't feel relief. They felt something closer to borrowed time. Every safe encounter simply meant the next one would be harder. The Germans were searching more often. Informants were becoming bolder. And the places where SOE agents met their contacts, cafes, train stations, bars, back rooms, were growing more dangerous by the week. The well rod, ingenious though it was, couldn't keep up with the tightening of occupation pressure. It was still too large to hide on the body during a proper search. It needed a pocket or a coat with structure. And in a world where agents lived with only what they could carry and wore whatever clothing their cover story allowed, that wasn't always possible. A quick pat-down was enough to reveal its weight, and even if it remained hidden, drawing it required a moment of space agents rarely had. Station 9 had already given them disguised explosives, collapsible weapons, silent pistols, and more covert gadgets than most soldiers even knew existed. But none of those inventions solved the problem of being face-to-face with an enemy officer in a crowded room, under suspicion, with seconds to act and no room to move. SOE needed something smaller, something even quieter, something that could sit against the inside of an agent's arm without raising suspicion, even when a guard ran a hand along a sleeve. In early 1944, that request arrived at the Frythe, the estate in Welwyn that concealed Britain's most secret wartime workshop. Here, engineers worked behind blackout curtains, testing designs that lived entirely outside conventional thinking. They weren't tied to military tradition. They were guided by necessity. If a device solved the problem, it didn't matter how strange it looked. The first task was to strip a gun down to its absolute minimum. What parts were essential? What parts existed only because guns were normally made a certain way? Could a firearm survive without a grip, without sights, without any recognizable silhouette at all? Piece by piece, the traditional shape disappeared. What remained was a short steel tube, no longer than a man's forearm, a simple firing mechanism, a single chamber, just enough engineering to deliver a silent shot at point-blank range, and nothing else. No handle to betray it, no outline to give it away. If a guard felt it during a search, it would register as a stiff seam, a brace, an innocuous length of fabric reinforcement. Something forgettable. It was held in place by elastic or sewn straps lying alongside the inside of the arm. Drawing it required only a gentle downward turn of the wrist, the kind of motion that could be made while adjusting a sleeve or reaching for a drink. A second later, it would be in the hand. A second after that, it could be fired. This was not a battlefield weapon. It was a contingency built for the moments when an agent's legend collapsed, when a meeting went wrong, when the wrong eyes lingered on them for 1 second too long. It was built for the space between a question and a whistle being blown. And yet, for such a specialized device, its actual operational history is cloaked in ambiguity. The sleeve gun existed. It was tested. It was issued in extremely limited numbers. but records of its use are almost non-existent, partly because agents operating in such conditions rarely survived if things went badly, and partly because the kind of moments this weapon was built for were never meant to be recorded at all. There is, however, one story. It doesn't appear in official documentation, and it can't be verified in the way historians prefer, but it comes from a consistent thread of recollections, a demonstration, or perhaps an actual encounter, in a bar somewhere in occupied territory. An agent or an instructor or a resistance member attempting to show just how quiet a concealed weapon could be. A shot fired under a table or against a padded surface, while drinks were being poured and voices rose and fell around them. And according to the story, not a single person looked up. It's the kind of account that fits perfectly with the sleeve gun's purpose, a weapon designed to disappear, to speak only in whispers, to do its work so quietly that the room carried on unchanged. Yet this raises the greater mystery. If the sleeve gun was created for moments like Lion, and if it was capable of being fired unnoticed, why does so little evidence of its use survive? Was it issued too late to see meaningful deployment? Were its missions never recorded? Or did it simply belong to a world where the success of a tool was measured by the total absence of any trace it was ever there at all? Even after the sleeve gun was built, life for SOE agents didn't slow or soften. The war in France continued to tighten. Patrols increased. Searches became routine. And places that once felt anonymous, smoky bars, crowded cafes, railway waiting rooms, began to feel like stages where the cast never changed and every mistake had an audience. There is a recollection from a resistance safe house in the Ardennes where an SOE courier described his greatest fear as the moment before a search when the room stops breathing. That stillness, he wrote, was the only warning an agent ever received. A guard's eyes narrowing, a hand raised, a command spoken with too much authority, and in those seconds every agent knew precisely how little they carried that could help them. If one of those guards had walked toward a man wearing a sleeve gun, they would have found nothing suspicious. A firm seam, a stiff cuff, perhaps a brace, but nothing shaped like a firearm, nothing heavy enough to trigger doubt, and that was exactly why the weapon existed. The sleeve gun, at its core, was not a cut-down pistol. It was built from the beginning as a single-purpose tool, a point-blank, silent shot in the smallest possible footprint. Engineers at Station Noir designed it around a simple principle. You do not need a grip if you are only firing at arm's length. You do not need sights if the target is directly in front of you. You do not need a magazine if the entire purpose is one controlled moment. So instead of a traditional frame, the weapon was essentially a cylindrical body, a steel tube machined to house a striker-fired mechanism. A single chamber sat at the forward end, preloaded before the weapon was strapped to the arm. A safety catch was incorporated into the design, but discreetly, because anything protruding made the weapon harder to conceal. When drawn, the user would wrap their hand around the tube and depress the firing mechanism with the thumb, allowing a controlled, deliberate discharge. It was typically chambered in .32 ACP, a cartridge that, in its standard form, was already subsonic. Unlike 9mm Parabellum, it did not produce a supersonic crack, and at the short distances the sleeve gun was intended for, the difference in stopping power was irrelevant. This wasn't a weapon for range. It wasn't meant to fight through clothing or armor. It was intended for direct, point-blank application, where a single shot to the head or torso would be decisive. When you imagine it being used in a room like that bar in Lyon, you begin to understand the engineer's priorities. Nothing about the weapon was designed for elegance. Everything was designed for plausibility, concealment over comfort, discretion over power, silence over speed. It was the purest example of applied necessity in Station 9's entire catalogue. And yet the engineering choices reveal something else as well. The sleeve gun was always meant to be a last resort, a fallback, a tool for the exact moment when an agent's cover shattered and there was no other way to escape. That intention is written into the design. One shot, deliberate, controlled, with no illusions about what came after. It was a weapon built for survival in the next 10 seconds, not the next 10 minutes. But as ingenious as the design was, It raises questions too. How reliable was it under stress? How many prototypes were made? How did the weapon perform in controlled tests? And how did it compare to the well rod, its older, more famous sibling, when both were placed in the hands of agents expecting silence? Those answers lie in the next part of the story, where the focus shifts from what the sleeve gun was to how it behaved under pressure, how it was manufactured, and why its operational history remains such a quiet mystery. Just like the weapon itself, the deeper you go, the more the silence begins to make sense. In the workshops at Station 9, the sleeve gun moved from concept to reality through a series of quiet, methodical tests. This wasn't a weapon that required dramatic trials or long-range marksmanship. Its entire purpose lived within a distance measured in inches. What mattered was reliability, concealment, and the absence of sound that would betray the user. Those became the metrics by which the engineers judged it. During early testing, the biggest challenge wasn't accuracy. At point-blank range, accuracy was a matter of placement, not engineering. What the designers focused on instead was ensuring the weapon could be drawn cleanly under stress. They practiced the movement dozens of times. The hand drops, the wrist turns, the fingers slide along the inside of the arm, and the tube appears in the palm. The motion had to be simple enough that an agent could perform it even when adrenaline was high and the room around them was thick with danger. And as the prototypes improved, that motion became instinctive, so fast and so natural that it no longer looked like drawing a weapon at all. It looked like adjusting a sleeve. Reliable firing was the next priority. The sleeve gun used a striker-fired mechanism, simple and sturdy, but simplicity alone wasn't enough. In a real-life confrontation, the moment of firing would be furtive and rushed. The engineers needed to know that the weapon would discharge when commanded, without misfires or hesitation. So they loaded it again and again, firing into sandbags, blocks of wax, and padded boards meant to absorb sound. Not for power, its power was never in question, but for consistency. The weapon needed to behave the same way every time, because hesitation or failure would leave an agent exposed in the worst possible circumstances. Sound was tested differently. Unlike the well rod, with its elaborate internal suppressor, the sleeve gun relied on the inherent quiet of subsonic .32 ACP and the sealed non-cycling action. In tests, its report was a soft, muted crack, quieter than an air pistol, sometimes indistinguishable from a knocked chair leg or a boot scuff on a wooden floor. One engineer described the sound as a cough from inside a coat. That, more than anything, made the weapon useful. The noise didn't travel. It didn't echo. It stayed trapped within the small space it was fired in, lost beneath the ordinary ambience of a bar, a cafe, or a busy street. But testing also revealed limitations. The weapon was a single-shot tool. There were no quick follow-up shots. If the first round didn't resolve the situation, an agent had nothing else to rely on. The range was minimal by design, and unlike the well rod, which could operate multiple times before its internal wipes degraded, the sleeve gun had no such longevity. It was a one-moment weapon, built for the narrowest margin between survival and discovery. Manufacturing records suggest that prototypes were produced in small numbers, possibly hand-fitted, possibly never reaching true mass production. Station 9 was accustomed to building small runs, distributing weapons only to those operatives for whom they were truly necessary. But the sleeve gun's secrecy ran deeper than most. It wasn't photographed often. It wasn't formally catalogued in the way other covert devices were. It lived in a world where documentation created risk, and risk was the one thing SOE avoided at all costs. Comparisons to the well rod in internal notes show the distinction clearly. The well rod was a precision tool designed for repeated silent kills, sabotage missions, resistance actions, and clandestine eliminations. The sleeve gun was the opposite. A stopgap for the moment when everything else had failed, when a search was imminent, when a meeting had gone wrong, when an officer stepped too close. Its existence is unquestioned, yet its appearance in the documented wartime narrative is almost a ghost. This silence leads naturally to the next question, one that historians still debate. If the sleeve gun was tested, issued and ready, then why wasn't it used? What changed? What happened instead? What makes the sleeve gun so unusual isn't simply its design, or its silence, or even its secrecy. It's the sense that it arrived at the exact moment when its purpose was beginning to slip away. By early 1944, the world SOE had been built to fight was already changing beneath its feet. The tide of the war had turned. The Allied invasion was approaching. Resistance groups were shifting from quiet survival to active preparation for liberation. And the kind of tight, claustrophobic undercover meetings that had defined the early years of occupation were becoming less frequent, less central, and far more dangerous for the Germans than for the Allies. This shift didn't make the sleeve gun irrelevant. It simply meant that the perfect moment for its use, the kind of moment shown in that bar in Lyon, was passing. And when you examine the historical record, you begin to see the reasons its operational history is so faint. Production numbers were always small. Station 9 never had much reason to manufacture the sleeve gun in quantity because it was a weapon for specialists, not for field units. Surviving paperwork suggests that no more than a few dozen were made, possibly fewer. Most were prototypes, hand-machined pieces produced in small batches as the design evolved. This was never meant to be a mass-issue firearm. It was a scalpel, not a sword. Variations did exist. Early prototypes experimented with different safety catches, different methods of retention against the arm, and even minor changes to the firing mechanism. But the basic idea, single-shot, .32 ACP, silent at arm's length, never changed. It was a simple idea refined, not a complex idea expanded. As for what became of the sleeve guns after the war, the answer is largely silence. SOE itself was dissolved in January 1946, and many of its specialized weapons were either destroyed or absorbed into MI6 and other intelligence departments. Some sleeve guns likely went into storage, others were almost certainly scrapped. A few found their way into collections, though not openly. To this day, confirmed surviving examples are extremely rare. One is known to be in the Imperial War Museum's collection. Another exists in a private collection with credible provenance. Beyond that, the trail fades, quietly, appropriately. Did the sleeve gun influence later spy weapons? Indirectly, yes. Not in its exact form, no later intelligence service adopted its peculiar shape, but in its philosophy. Cold War agencies across the world developed their own concealable tools based on the same principle, a weapon that didn't look like one, a weapon that could be carried without suspicion, a weapon for the moment when an agent had no other options. In that sense, the sleeve gun's legacy lives not in its mechanics, but in its mindset. And the question everyone wonders, the question that hangs over the entire story, was it ever actually used? There is no confirmed record, no surviving mission file, no agent memoir that describes it explicitly. But absence is not the same as certainty. The sleeve gun was issued. It was carried. It was tested in conditions identical to those faced by agents in the field. And wartime silence is not unusual for devices like this. Some missions were never reported. Some agents did not return. Some weapons were designed for moments so quiet that no one else in the room would ever have known what had happened. A single shot, unnoticed, in a crowded bar is entirely plausible. It fits the weapon. It fits the era. It fits the need. Perhaps the sleeve gun's greatest achievement is that no trace of its work survives. A tool built for silence would, if successful, leave nothing behind. Not a sound, not a record, not a story loud enough to carry into the future. And so the sleeve gun remains what it was always meant to be, a quiet answer to a very loud problem. A weapon shaped by fear, necessity, and the realities of covert life in occupied Europe. It belonged to the narrowest margin between survival and discovery, and when that margin finally widened, as liberation swept across France and Belgium and the Netherlands, it slipped out of relevance as quietly as it had entered. Yet it leaves behind a perfect reflection of the world that created it. A world of whispered meetings, forged papers, and the moment in Lyon when an SOE agent stood face to face with danger and had nothing to help him except luck. The sleeve gun was built for that moment. It just arrived too late to change its outcome. And in Britain's hidden arsenal, that makes it one of the most fascinating weapons of all. A device engineered for an instant that passed, a threat that faded, and a silence so complete that history barely remembers it at all.